thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to get to speak to a non-academic audience. Not that you aren't academic, but outside of a university setting. And this is a special occasion. This is my first talk ever without slides. So we'll see how that goes. I am a professor of management and organizations at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University, but my core identity is that of a psychologist. I'm a social psychologist, and just so we're all clear, by psychologist I don't mean like Freudian psychology or diagnosing depression. I'm the type of psychologist who does research, and the book that I produced that was released a month ago is basically the culmination of 15 years of research, neuroimaging research, behavioral research, survey research. And broadly, my 15 years of research has been on the topic of humanization and dehumanization. And I'll start by taking a moment to define what I mean by humanization and dehumanization. So at the most basic level, humanization refers to deep social engagement with another person, deeply connecting with another person, considering another person, and dehumanization is just the opposite, neglecting another person or treating another person as no different than an object or subhuman animal. To get a bit more technical about how we define dehumanization in our studies and humanization, humanization we really refer to as the consideration of another person as having a mind, an inner mental life, the capability for thoughts, feelings, intentions, desires, dreams, wishes, etc. All this inner mental stuff that we don't see. And to the extent that we consider another person to have a mind, we are humanizing them. To the extent that we are failing to consider another person's inner mental life, we are dehumanizing them. And what I have based the book on is this idea that's evident in the data that we've been subtly engaging in more and more dehumanization toward each other over the past at least 5 decades. So how can we document this trend, what I'm calling a dehumanizing shift? We can look at various data sources, and unfortunately there's no set of surveys that measures dehumanization per se, but there's a lot of good survey data out there that measures topics related to dehumanization. So for example, we can look at studies of empathy. And luckily for us, people have been asking college students about how frequently they experience empathy since about the late 70s. And you can look at how college students were responding in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and then the 21st century. And if you look at people's scores on these empathy surveys, college students, it's been a downward shift. And what do these questions look like? They basically ask people how likely is it that you would find yourself feeling distress if you saw another person in distress? Or how often do you take other people's perspectives? This is what we mean by empathy. And what you see is a decrease on people reporting that, yeah, I tend to take the perspective of others. I tend to be able to feel other people's pain. So that's one piece of evidence for the dehumanizing shift. We can also look at reports of how much people trust one another. So the General Social Survey, a nationally representative survey that's administered every year in the US, has been asking a question about trust since the 70s. And the nature of the question is pretty much, in general, would you say most people can be trusted? It turns out that if you look from the 1970s to today, increasingly, people disagree with that statement. People say, more and more, no, I don't agree. Most people cannot be trusted. All right? So distrust of others has been on the rise. We can also look at the data on loneliness and pure socializing. And the topic of loneliness is a bit controversial over the past few years. Sometimes you see a downturn in loneliness, sometimes an upswing. But if we look at data from the past 10 years that looks at high school age and college age students, what you see is a clear uptick in loneliness coupled with a decline in high school and college age students saying that they frequently go to parties or hang out with friends. So all of this put together suggests that we're increasingly disengaged from one another. This is something that you probably hear quite a bit about. Luckily, there's data to support it as well. And now all of the data that I've told you about so far comes from the United States. There's an even broader global phenomenon that fits with this data, which is the rise of individualism. So virtually every country on the planet for which survey data exists shows a rise in people valuing individualism over collectivism. And let me unpack what this means so you can see how it's related to dehumanization. Individualism simply refers to the idea of people placing a high value on the self, on independence, on self-expression, on personal choice, personal freedom, all good things, but placing a value on those things more so than collectivity, connection, conformity, conforming to a social norm. And so here there's data going back to the 1960s, surveys asked all around the world that show basically a rise in individualism across the globe, including the United States. China is an outlier in that regard. They've experienced a rise in collectivism. A few more countries that can be true of as well. But virtually every country otherwise has experienced a rise in individualism. How is individualism related to dehumanization? I can illustrate this by using an example from my neighborhood where I live in Chicago. I live on the north side of Chicago, about a mile north of Wrigley Field. It's a reasonably nice neighborhood and a very socially progressive neighborhood. And it's the type of neighborhood where you would be likely to see signs in people's windows or on people's lawns with slogans like, hate has no home here, no human being is illegal, Black Lives Matter, pro-LGBTQ messaging. So very socially progressive signs you would see on people's houses. And yet a few years ago, when there was a proposal to turn a building in the neighborhood into a halfway house for people getting out of prison or addicts getting out of treatment centers, there was opposition to the halfway house. And if you look at some internet comments, you'd see objections like, well, this could affect property values, or we don't know what type of people are going to be at this place. There are kids in the neighborhood. And I think this paradox perfectly encapsulates individualism. Individualism says we're tolerant of everyone to express themselves and to be themselves. We value everyone to be themselves. We just don't necessarily want to live next to them and engage with them. And so again, individualism is not necessarily a negative thing, but I think it corresponds to this rise in dehumanization, or this dehumanizing shift. So in looking at the data and seeing that this dehumanizing shift has occurred, I also point to what I call 4 pillars of dehumanization. Things that, trends that have also manifested out of dehumanization and continue to cause dehumanization. And 3 of these will be very clear to you, very easy to explain. I'll spend an additional bit of time on the 4th one. So the 4 pillars of dehumanization, trends that you see since the 60s or 70s that have some relationship to dehumanization. One very clear one is the rise of automation. And by automation, I just mean the fact that machines and systems and algorithms pervade our daily lives. And what this means is that interactions between other people are increasingly mediated. In real life, face-to-face, deep social engagement is increasingly replaced by interaction through screens and text. And certainly we're able to cast a wider net in terms of our connection with others, but it's no replacement for deep in-person interaction. In addition, basic tasks that we used to rely on other humans for, such as asking directions or asking someone what's the best Italian restaurant with vegan options, we can now use machines to answer those questions. So what automation does, again, making no value judgment here, is it does separate people, and it makes people less reliant on others. It decreases interdependence, increases independence. So automation is one pillar of dehumanization. The second, of no surprise to you, is what I call stratification, which is just the rise of income inequality. And we know from Thomas Piketty's book Capital and other data sources that increasingly people in the lowest socioeconomic classes are separate from people in the highest socioeconomic classes. This is a trend occurring over decades. And so people of different social classes intermingle less and less than ever before. Third pillar of this dehumanizing shift, which again will be of no surprise to you, is political polarization. So increasingly, people who identify as being on the political left feel disconnected from people on the political right, and vice versa. This is apparent in data on which media sources people use, how people evaluate the President of the United States. Increasingly, those favorability polls show more polarization, and how members of Congress talk and the type of legislation they endorse. So these are three ways that people are being broadly pulled apart from one another. And then the fourth one, which requires a little bit more explanation, is what I call marketization. And marketization is really a term popularized by Michael Sandel in his book, What Money Can't Buy. And what Sandel's book basically says is that at least since the 1970s, there's been a rise broadly in the free marketization of everything. And what that means is that things that previously couldn't be bought or sold can now be bought and sold. So, for example, he talks about how now school kids are being paid to read books occasionally. Or if you're a single occupancy vehicle driver, you can pay to get access to the carpool lane. Or if you have enough money, certain physicians will let you pay to have their home phone number in case of emergency. And on, he gives several examples of this. And so what does it mean if we increasingly find ourselves in a buyer-seller relationship with people? That means our relationships with one another are increasingly based on exchange, where we sort of evaluate others in terms of what can they do for me in terms of the marketplace, rather than evaluating people in terms of just being part of the same community members. And so how does this relate to dehumanization? I'll give you two extreme examples of how marketization dehumanizes, and then I'll tie this into our current discussion and debate on immigration. So two extreme examples that I talk about in the book. One of them comes from the South by Southwest Festival in Austin, Texas. So probably many of you are familiar with this festival. People go to see music, see film, talk about tech, et cetera. It's a big deal. And a few years ago, a marketing firm hired homeless individuals to wear T-shirts and equipped each homeless person with a Wi-Fi router. And the T-shirt read, essentially, I am a Wi-Fi hotspot. Log on at this code, and you can pay something like $2 for 15 minutes to get access to me. I'm a Wi-Fi router. And so immediately you can see that this publicity move was met with backlash, because you're literally treating homeless people as sort of a good or a service, right? That's one extreme example of marketization, where a class of individuals, and a particularly stigmatized class, the homeless, are being treated as stores of value. A second example comes from Disney World, where a few years ago, the New York Post wrote a story about how wealthy families were actually paying for disabled individuals to accompany them to Disney World because there are auxiliary lines at many of the rides at Disney World, or at least there were at the time, where you could get priority access to the rides if you had a disability. So again, this is an example of literally purchasing another human being as a service or as a good rather than treating them simply as a human being. And again, these are extreme examples, but I've started to notice that this tendency to kind of marketize our relationships has made its way into our debate on immigration. And so you probably know that opponents of immigration will oftentimes use like real dehumanizing language, using the language of invasion or sometimes likening immigrants to animals or an infestation. And supporters of immigration, or those who attempt to counter anti-immigration narratives, will often make some of the following arguments. They'll say, you don't understand, actually, immigrants provide a net positive to the economy. And there is indeed data, at least data I know of from Europe to support this idea. Or they'll say things like, some of our greatest Nobel Prize winners were immigrants, or some of our top PhD students are immigrants, or Steve Jobs' father was a migrant, and if we had not let Steve Jobs' father into the country, there would be no Steve Jobs, there would be no Apple. Or the late Anthony Bourdain made the argument that if Trump's very restrictive immigration policy on Mexico went through, he said the whole restaurant industry would crumble. And you get where these arguments are coming from. They're attempting to counter the narrative that immigrants are a net negative on society. But what they're doing, perhaps unintentionally, is they're describing the value of immigrants in terms of their market value, their economic value, rather than their value as human beings, worthy of dignity and safety and security and things like that. And we could have a separate conversation about whether the arguments, one way or another, are effective. The point is, the marketizing rhetoric has ramped up. And so this is the evidence I'm trying to provide for the dehumanizing shift. And to let you guys in on a bit of a secret about my book, initially, when I wanted to write a book, I just wanted to write a book about this, the dehumanizing shift. And I worked with a very smart, excellent book agent, and I sent him this proposal. I said I would write about this phenomenon of sort of the subtle dehumanizing shift that we've experienced over the past few decades. And he said, that's a interesting idea, but nobody wants to read a depressing book. So then I thought, I had to think really over the course of 3 years or so, how could I turn this topic into something less depressing? And so now, the book that has been produced essentially takes the dehumanizing shift as the premise of chapter 1, and the rest of the book is about why it matters to keep humans top of mind, and how we can rehumanize the world around us. And it's not necessarily a given that this dehumanizing shift is a negative, but I present at least 4 reasons as to why keeping humans top of mind and engaging in more humanization is really valuable to us. So let me go through those 4 reasons. So the first reason why it's worthwhile to keep humans top of mind is that humans provide our lives with a lot of meaning, okay? And in fact, this might seem obvious, but mere human touch has all sorts of magical powers that are fairly surprising. So there are studies showing that people who are experiencing extreme pain, who are experiencing electric shocks or severe heat pain, if they hold the hand of a loved one, they actually report the painful experience to be less aversive, and their brain activity associated with pain is reduced as well. So holding another person's hand. The power of human touch is very vast in that regard. There are other studies showing that touching someone on the shoulder or lightly touching someone can make another person more likely to comply with a favor request. There are even studies of NBA basketball teams showing that teams that engage in more human touch, more backslapping, handshaking, perform more cooperatively on the court and win more games as a result. And consumers seem to know that there's something special about human touch as well. So now there's several studies showing that people value objects more if they know the object was made by a human versus produced by a machine. And you can even give people the exact same object, say a coffee mug, and tell them the mug was made by a human or the mug was made by a machine. If you tell them the mug was made by a human, they're willing to pay more for it, and they like the object more. And it's interesting if you ask them why. The reason they give oftentimes is that they believe that the object is made with love when it's made by a human. And the belief is that machines, at least not yet, machines can't experience love yet. Human touch also gives objects authenticity. There's other research showing that. And people also value things more when they see the human effort behind it. So one of my favorite studies on this point comes from Harvard Business School, where they asked students in the cafeteria to order a sandwich, all right, at the sandwich station. And either they said, order a sandwich, wait over there, the sandwich will be delivered to you, or order a sandwich, watch the person prepare your sandwich, and get the sandwich at the end. And then for both groups, they asked them, essentially, how much did you enjoy the sandwich experience? And when people watched the human effort that went into the sandwich making process, they valued the sandwich experience more, because there's value in seeing the human effort behind something. There's even studies showing that people enjoy an electric massage more if they know that a human is controlling the massager versus if the machine is controlling the massage on its own, because there's something special about human intentionality behind the experience. So that's point number one, is that humans, the presence of humans, gives our lives a lot of meaning. Point number two is that humans imbue our lives with morality. We sort of intuitively follow Kant's law that humans are worth of dignity and shouldn't be treated as a means to an end. And so when we see even the slightest trace of humanity, we act in a more morally careful way. A few years ago, Honda actually decided to make their motorcycle grills look more like human faces, because they had done some research and they showed that people process human-like motorcycle grills in the same way that they process human faces, and the idea that people would behave with more care if they saw a human face on the road. We also have research showing that if you get people to humanize a self-driving car, if you give the car a name or a voice, or if you give human-like qualities to animals, people care more for whatever the thing is. And there's even research showing that people care more about endangered species or donate more to endangered species to the extent to which they perceive the particular animal to be human-like. There's this idea that human equals moral, and we should care for human-like things. This is also why there's research showing that in terms of charitable appeals, if you want to get people to donate to a refugee organization or an anti-poverty organization, showing people a single individual suffering is more powerful than showing people a group that's suffering. Why? Because a single individual is clearly a human. There's nothing more human than a single human. As soon as you show a group of people, it starts to resemble what Joseph Stalin purportedly referred to as a statistic. He didn't actually say that, but legend has. He said something like that. So showing people a single individual goes a long way to triggering our moral sense. So humans give us meaning. Humans make us act with more morality. And then there are two other reasons why humans are psychologically powerful. One is that humans influence us to behave, to engage in collective action in ways that we don't even anticipate. So it's probably unsurprising to you that I tell you people do things because other people do them. Right? We could call this conformity or social proof or social norms. You see millions of examples of this. This is why McDonald's says trillions and trillions served. This is why nightclubs artificially inflate their lines. So you think, oh, a bunch of people want to get into that nightclub. I should go there as well. We're all very aware that humans are influenced by other humans. But the surprising thing is that if you ask people why they do certain things and what are they influenced by, they often fail to recognize how influenced they are by other humans. And a lot of the best examples of this come from studies of environmentalism or environmentally friendly behavior. So if you ask people, why do you try to save energy in your house? Or why are you interested in buying an electric car? People will say things like, well, saving money is important, or I'm influenced to do this because it benefits society, or it helps the environment. But in fact, when you look at why people tend to engage in environmentally conscious behaviors, it's typically because they see their neighbors doing it as well. There's virtually no greater influence source to get people to engage in not littering or saving energy than showing people that others are doing it as well. So humans are a powerful source of influence, one that we underestimate. So humans give our lives meaning, they give our lives morality, they move us to act in collective ways. And the final reason why humans are psychologically important is that humans are a major source of motivation. So there's a lot of research now showing that humans will do things for others, on behalf of others, that they wouldn't even do for their own personal benefit. There's research showing that in workplaces, when you give people the sense that their work has impact on another human being, they'll work harder. People tend to work harder for companies when they know the company donates to charity because they feel like my work is having a positive effect on another human. People in many cases work harder when they get what we call a pro-social bonus. That is a bonus that comes to you, but you are required to spend it on others. There's studies showing that people will collaborate more and engage in better teamwork if they receive one of these pro-social bonuses rather than a bonus just for me, for my personal gain. And there's research showing that if you pay people to do a dull task and tell them, for every letter, for every time you find a typo on this page or come up with an anagram, we'll pay you X amount versus for every level of effort you put in, we'll pay someone else. Oftentimes, people work harder on behalf of others, other humans, than they would themselves. And this whole phenomenon is best described by a grad student friend of mine who called the general phenomenon the James Bond effect. And he called it the James Bond effect because of this classic spy movie trope, this Bond trope, more common to the older Bond films, where Bond would get captured by the villain, right? And the villain would say, give me the code, give me the key, give me the diamonds, or I'll torture you. And Bond would say something like, I'll never tell you. You can torture me all you want. And at just that moment, the villain would then produce Bond's girlfriend and would say something like, well, if you don't tell me, I'm going to torture her, at which point Bond would leap into action. So this is the cinematic idea that we often are motivated to do things on behalf of other humans that we wouldn't even do for personal gain. And so the first part of the book is explaining, going through all these psychological processes about why humans are psychologically important. The rest of the book is to give some advice about how do we do this? How do we reinfuse humanity into our daily lives, in the workplace, in interactions with technology, in conflict scenarios, in geopolitical conflict or basic day-to-day conflict, and even in our close relationships. And I summarize all of this by saying that none of this is easy. It requires time and it requires effort. But the benefit of humanizing each other more is we get the greatest power of humans that we know of, which is the power of social connection, which helps us to become happier and live longer. So that is my argument why we should reverse the dehumanizing shift. And I'm happy to take any questions on any of the topics. Thank you very much.
Not sure how much of a nitpick this is, but how do you square this with the fact that humans, being terrible machines, our bonding dispositions are sort of connected to our parochialism, and like oxytocin as a metonym makes us, reach out to the people close to us. It also makes us prepared to fight everyone else. And then once we do accept people into that closer community, you get into things like, like Fisk and Rye were researching where there are certain kinds of violence that we will only inflict on people that are, close into our moral sphere.
Yeah, so it's a good question. A lot of my work, my research has been on this parochialism idea that connection to in-group members can have a cost to out-group members because oftentimes these things are correlated, and there are awful examples of this throughout history, that you get very bonded groups who are then capable of doing awful things. The idea that I'm talking about, which might be a little wishful, but I think there's evidence of this as well, is being able to break out of those in-groups and to engage in kind of more of a universalist connection. And so in the chapter that I talk about on conflict, I talk about how oftentimes a lot of the research on in-groups and out-groups who don't get along, a typical solution that's proposed to resolve that conflict is to just make people unite under a common identity, a common humanity. And that can work sometimes and can go, it can work in certain cases, but it neglects the fact that in-groups and out-groups are often operating at different positions of power. And so in-groups and out-groups, groups at different levels of power, majority, minority, they need different things. And so if we're really going to be serious about forming some sort of universal connection, we need to take into account what low power people need as well as high power people. And then to your point about Fisk and Ride, I think you're referring to the idea that oftentimes a lot of violence that's been committed throughout history is in the service of some moral means, or people at least justify it in terms of some moral principle for loyalty, like we have to harm them to maintain the loyalty in our group, or we have to harm them to defend our own group. And so the idea there would be to shift to a different principle, sort of a broader moral foundation for care of all people.
So you said that this has been happening for the past several decades. Do you see any correlation between societies that have become more complex and more of our daily time is taken up by basically everything, and so you feel okay saying, well, I can't humanize all these people, I've got too much things to do, or is that not really correlated?
That's a great question. So the question is essentially, as our societies have become more complex, or as we're now capable of connecting with so many people, is that somehow depleting and makes us less capable of connecting with others? That is something I would love to test. It's testable. The best explanation that I've heard for this broad phenomenon, at least on the individualism part, goes something like this. It's not so much about complexity, although I would imagine that's part of the story. The argument that's put forth by political scientist Christian Welzel and the psychologist John Haidt, I think, endorses this, is that as countries around the globe have become wealthier and safer, what that means is that there's less need to be concerned about basic security or basic needs being met. And so what that does is that when you're sort of worried about where your next meal is coming from, or worried about war or famine or all these things, societies have to operate in a very tight collectivist fashion. You need to make sure the group is very tight. As the world has become wealthier and safer, you see that tightness sort of going away, and people saying, all right, well, instead of being concerned about the tightness of the group, I can spend more time being concerned about the welfare of single individuals. And that's where I think the individualism comes from. But I'm a big proponent of the idea that our ability to socialize with others is finite. And so as we are bombarded with social life, I think that can become depleting and would indeed prevent us from connecting with others.
So the factors you identified that cause dehumanization are sort of long-term structural trends that are not under anybody in particular's control and seem unlikely to reverse on their own or be reversed. Yeah. The remedy you point to seems to be individual desire and effort. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, and I realize that is what it sounds like, that I'm putting the responsibility on individuals. However, at least one of those pillars, which I think people in this room would be sympathetic to, has the possibility of re-engineering the process, and that would be automation. So even as I argue that automation has broadly separated people from each other, when you look at research on the effect of technology use or internet use or social media use, and this is research that I've done, on things like empathy, it's not necessarily a negative. It can be a positive. And this is surprising to people outside of this room because it's very easy to tell a story about how the cause of all social ills is technology. It's a story particularly that people who lived before the internet are sympathetic to. But automation is an interesting component because even though on the whole it's pulled people apart, I think there's a great opportunity for automation to cause new forms of connection. And that, and then to answer your question in particular, is that the responsibility of individuals? I think that's kind of a individual and collective responsibility to figure out, okay, how can this stuff be used for good? Or let's look at the studies where technology use has a net positive effect on empathy. Like there's a study of Dutch teenagers, a longitudinal study that shows that the more social media tech use at time 1 predicted more empathy on a survey at time 2. Well, that's really interesting and kind of goes against a lot of conventional wisdom. What are they doing? And my interpretation of that study is, well, what are they doing? They're using technology to complement in real life interactions, or they're using technology to further connect with people that they have offline interactions with. And so there's an example of how even as automation has contributed to the dehumanizing decline, it need not. And then I would put that responsibility on individuals, companies, governments, et cetera.
So you talked a little bit about different ways that things have gotten dehumanizing, either through politics or through social media use or through like the workplace. And then you kind of show that there's been a rise in individualism. Do you think it's pretty easy to, for us to individually use social media correctly, but the other ones are a little harder to individually have an effect on. Do you have an idea of which one kind of affects the overall outcome more, or?
Yeah, it's a good question. And so I called these four things: automation, polarization, stratification, marketization. I've called them pillars of dehumanization, which is kind of a cheat word, because like other academics would want to know, all right, are these things causes of dehumanization or outcomes of dehumanization? And I'm calling them pillars to say they're both. They're sort of markers of dehumanization. So which one do I think is, see, it's very difficult for me to pinpoint which one I would focus the most on, because I truly believe that they're cyclical. Like income inequality feeds distrust. Distrust of others feeds income inequality of, what are low socioeconomic status people going to do if we give them money, things like that. Similarly with political polarization, you see these conflict spirals with, say, Democrats and Republicans, where if there's some negative incident, you get people saying, well, this other side is motivated by a dislike of my side. We over here, we look out for our group, but these guys over there, they dislike us. And if they dislike us and they're operating out of a dislike of us, then I need to come back at them with more aggression. And so you can see how a single incident will polarize people, but then polarization contributes to this conflict, because if we never interact with people on the other side of the political aisle, we will never see that people on the other side of the political aisle probably have a lot of similarities to us in terms of basic things, like they care about their family, they look after their kids, etc. I would say the most interesting one, instead of dancing around the topic, the most interesting one is political polarization. Like, if we could solve that, that would take care of a lot of issues that would probably feed into some of these more economic things like marketization and income inequality. And that's what Google and everyone else is trying to figure out. Psychologists don't have the answer yet, but I could offer some thoughts on that too.
I agree with what you just said, and that actually brings me back to the very beginning of your talk, where you started a thread in my head running off, trying to figure out if dehumanization is actually the right word. Because it seems to me that what's happening, that I think is what you're worried about and what I'm worried about, is people treating other people far worse than they treat non-humans. And I'm struggling to find, what is that other word? Is it demonization or enemyification or that sort of thing? And have you thought about whether dehumanization is actually the right word for this? I cannot think of a better word at the moment. But
well, I've thought about it a lot, because a lot of people don't like the term. We get, especially in the academic publication process, we get a lot of pushback about, is this really the right term? Demonization is a term that Pinker uses in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, to describe things that happened during the Holocaust, where you intentionally treat another individual as subhuman and capable of harming you so that you can justify harm to them. So dehumanization, for me, is the best catch-all. It's the best catch-all. And if we stick to this idea of dehumanization as a failure to consider others as having an inner mental life, that's the one where I feel like I have the firmest data to support.
My fear is that actually we might be sometimes treating other people far worse because we actually acknowledge they have an inner life, but we don't like it and we oppose it. And is that seems worse than dehumanization, and a bigger problem, actually, maybe.
Yeah, and so there is some research to support that if we want to commit instrumental violence, that is, we would prefer to think of a victim of violence in some cases as having a mind. It's more satisfying to us in a way, and that I think that's kind of the most troubling form of human aggression. Anecdotally, there are also a lot of examples of people treating technology or pets as better than human beings in some ways, almost being sort of sympathetic to the idea that, well, these aren't fully mind-having creatures. It feels good in some cases to act nasty towards someone because you really do consider their mind. You consider their thoughts. And I think maybe this is what you're getting at in terms of political conflict. Oftentimes, when we take the perspective of the other side, we see what's in the other person's mind, and we don't like what we see. And so that's why oftentimes you hear, like in conflict scenarios, people will say, well, just try to take the other side's perspective on this. Oftentimes, perspective taking makes us act more harshly because we consider the other side as having a fully formed mind with all sorts of nasty thoughts toward us, and we react aggressively accordingly. So that might be what you're getting at. And I don't know what the best term for that is, but that is certainly a part of the phenomenon.
Is that being positively accepted by the general populations? Is that something that they're gearing towards, or is it kind of existent and therefore that's the system they go with?
It's a good question, and I don't really know the answer. The research that I'm citing is basically a group of folks who have looked at these global surveys given around the world since the 60s that tap into individualism and collectivism. And basically what they find that every country for which there's data except for Armenia, China, Croatia, Ukraine, and Uruguay show this rise in individualism. My sense is that in these 5 outlier countries, it's very consistent. People aren't fighting against a rise in collectivism. I've only been to one of these countries, that being China, and China is broadly, from what I can tell, a happy collectivist country. They're happy with collectivism. Collectivism has been a part of their culture for years, so it seems to work for them. On the other hand, these could just be outliers, but it is interesting that there's a real diversity amongst these outliers. Like, what do Armenia, Ukraine, Croatia, Uruguay, and China have in common? I'm not so sure. So, again, that's a great topic for people to study. What is it that's different amongst the countries where you don't see the rise in individualism? I mean, it's interesting to say Japan isn't on the list. In some ways, I was surprised that China was on the list. You think of China as becoming more like the US in many ways over the past few decades, and yet culturally is still very different. Question was, have I thought about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then have we departed from the principles of that, which essentially says to treat all human beings with dignity? It's very puzzling because in many ways that was a moment of real progress. And if you look at, forgetting about dehumanization for a moment, if you look at real instances of like mass atrocities and mass violence, certainly those things have declined in the wake of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I think it's the subtle forms of dehumanization, the pure disengagement from others, the kind of live and let live philosophy, that I'm going to do my thing, you do your thing, but I don't want to think about what you're thinking about, or I don't want to feel your pain, or I don't want to consider your wants and your needs. I think it could be an orthogonal shift, or maybe as a result of feeling like, well, real hardcore violence is declining, maybe we kind of relax and say, okay, I can focus more on myself now.
So you mentioned earlier that you thought it was possible for humans to kind of not do an us and them, but I just wanted to like clarify on that. Is it really possible for like the human brain to not to like really do an us without doing a them, or is it just larger and larger groups of us?
Yeah, it's certainly challenging. And I think people like to say, when they talk about political polarization, they like to talk about, well, this is just how humans are. They're inherently tribal. But certainly, humans are less tribal at this point in history than they were millennia ago. So something must have happened. And yes, oftentimes, what makes us is having an outgroup. But people are also very flexible in terms of being able to recategorize themselves. So I talk about people who have pointed to what happens when there's a superordinate enemy, right? So September 11th happens. Democrats and Republicans previously had been very much at odds with each other. And then you get, at least for a moment, this common enemy, the attack on the Twin Towers and in DC. And you get a lot of ideological connection because people identify as Americans rather than us and them. So but it's interesting, even in that example, there's still a them. You can recall the George W. Bush's speeches talking about, they hate us for our freedoms, or the Newsweek cover, why do they hate us? So there's still an us and a them, but the us and them that existed prior, which is Democrats and Republicans, was able to recategorize. So I think we are much more flexible than a lot of people give us credit for. The real challenge is, can we ever get to universalism, true universalism, where there's no outgroups? And that's what Peter Singer talks about in The Expanding Circle, that idea that our sense of in-group can continuously expand. I would like to think that it's possible, yeah.
If it turned into, like, there's the old proverb, me against my brother and me against my cousin, my brother and me and my cousin against our neighbors, and so on, and that sort of concentric thing. Mm-hmm. If we could, if we winded up trading that in for, my trans friend who isn't in the room and me against my embarrassing uncle at the Thanksgiving table, if we wind up with these sort of cross-cutting in-groups that sort of mitigate each other, that keep us from having the sort of violence-inducing simple concentricity, would that be a price worth paying if it, for example, breaks our ability to have these like really clean, strong bonds like we'd see in smaller societies?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's zero sum. It could be. It could be. But I'm not sure it is. So broadly, what you see in correspondence with this trend toward individualism, I sort of gave individualism a bad rap because that's part of my story. But part of the good part of individualism is way more, say, acceptance of perceived outsiders. So broadly, more tolerance and acceptance of outgroups or people who are members of minority groups. I mentioned that doesn't necessarily mean that we want to be friends with those people, but it's no longer an attitude towards, say, LGBTQ people where you'd say, we need to do something about them. That's one of the biggest trends over the past few decades, way more just global positivity toward LGBTQ individuals. And so even if one might think, okay, if we all of a sudden become tolerant toward anyone, does that dissipate our really tight familial bonds? One, I don't know if there's any evidence to suggest that's the case. And two, I think we just find different bonds. We just find close bonds with others. So, yeah, it's a good question. All right, thanks very much. Appreciate it.